Hello, everyone. My name is Josipa Majic. I'm from ID Guardian, and today we'll be talking about multimodal affective computing and how companies are using it in order to better understand and analyze the emotional reactions of their consumers. I'm very sorry we're not able to meet in person. This would be much better if this was face-to-face and if we had an opportunity to have an informal chat afterwards and also perhaps do some live demos. But hopefully, despite being remote, this session will be interesting and informative to you, and hopefully an introduction in a very interesting up and coming topic. So let's get started. The topic of today's presentation is analyzing and understanding emotions. And I first wanted to clarify a bit why our product is called Tacit. There's a really big trend in research around implicit research. The opposite of that would be traditional explicit research. And explicit deals with everything that we can self-report on. For example, questionnaires, interviews, every time a consumer has to say how they felt. The opposite of that would be implicit, essentially measuring how consumers are really behaving, because so much of what's happening today is really silent. And instead of relying on what consumers are saying, companies are increasingly monitor how they behave. And this is where biometrics as a source of objective information really comes into play. So that's why we named our product Tacit. The content of today's presentation will first be an introduction. So a bit about the topic, a bit about how it came about. Secondly, we'll be discussing the problem and solution. After that, tell a bit about us, a bit about the methodology, and then move forward to a case study and close with caveats and a conclusion. So the first, a bit about the intro. Our core expertise is really codifying emotional behaviors, whether they happen in front of screens or sometimes even in the actual physical world. And what we're using to do that is essentially proven, simple, and scalable technology that can be used to analyze primarily commercial stimuli. The problem that is happening is that consumers are not very good in articulating how we feel. This sounds simple and trivial, yet it's at the heart of most of the challenges we have, not only in our professional, but also in our personal lives. The classic example for this is the Henry Ford story when he said, if we were to ask consumers what they wanted, they would let us know that they wanted faster horses instead of cars. This is a bit of an exaggeration, but it actually clarifies the situation, which is that relying on what consumers said they felt is not the most reliable way to do commercial research. The reason why this is happening is that sometimes consumers are not comfortable with saying how they feel. Other times they can't seem to find the right words and articulate so well. But either way, it's not scalable and it doesn't allow automated intervention because it's not data-driven. As a result, for the researcher, it's very difficult to get granular feedback that they can break down, whether it's if we're talking about an online content on a frame by frame basis, or if we're talking about the real world on a millisecond by millisecond basis, because that's how sensitive and granular emotional reactions that are evoked are. The reason why we want this is because researchers need something that is both accurate and actionable for the production teams. So the solution that we see is using data-driven monitoring in order to break down emotional reactions on a frame by frame, a millisecond by millisecond basis, and then codify what works best for your audience. Being able to slice and dice the data, for example, by demographic, older or younger, by location, urban or rural, or for example, by format, photos or videos. When we talk about objective information, what we primarily mean is biometric data such as EEG, the electrical impulses from your brain, or ECG, the cardio data that we can collect, but also a range of other data sets such as facial coding, the micro expressions on our face, or for example, eye tracking, where we're looking on the screen with our eyes. All of this can be tracked, measured, and then crunched into something that is both granular enough, accurate and actionable for the teams. Now, why are we different and why are we even talking about this? For some of you that have been familiar with this field, you know that this is not new technology. 10 or 15 years ago, this was known as neuromarketing. And before, they would use anything from fMRI and neuroimaging techniques all the way to EEG. And then in the later years, there has been a mini renaissance of fields such as neuroeconomics, where again, primarily neuroimaging tools were used to analyze and detect different patterns for decision making. So what's actually new in this market is that it would use to take an entire medical lab, technicians, and much more expensive medical equipment in order to run these experiments 5 or 10 years ago. What's been happening in recent years is that there has been a drop in the price of sensors. And a lot of these formerly very robust devices are now present in a form of a sleek wearable. And we also carry around these powerful computing devices in our pocket, so we can actually collect the data using sleek wearables and transfer the data using the smartphone, the same way you would actually do this 10 years ago in a lab, where you would have complex and robust medical equipment and a technician that would be using a powerful PC to collect and then transfer the data. So the reason why we're different is because we can use simple, affordable, and easy to use off-the-shelf wearables paired with nothing but your smartphone in order to conduct these experiments. And this was not possible years ago. The way Tacit works is we use 4 simple steps. So when running an experiment, the first thing you would do as a respondent is that you would put on wearables. Now, the wearables can be simple or it can be complex. It depends on the brief and on the structure of the design of the project and the research experiment. But they can be as simple as, for example, the Aura ring that I'm wearing. So the first thing that you do is you put on your wearables. The second step is that you download the mobile app from Google Play or the App Store and you pop it up. The second step is very crucial for our methodology, which is essentially us getting to know your baseline. Your baseline is your true, normal, relaxed self. And the way we calculate this is by asking you to answer, as we call them, emotionally neutral questions, where we get to know how you generally interact with questions, with devices, and we get to know just how does your biometric profile look like when you're normal and when you're relaxed. The reason why this is so important is because based on your baseline, we calculate the delta that arises from the stimuli, and this is how we get to know what a reaction is for you, because what is happiness for me might not be the happiness for the next guy. And this is why using your personal baseline in order to calibrate the algorithms is so important. After getting your baseline, the thing we do is we essentially let you enjoy the experience of whatever it is that we're testing in the most authentic and seamless way. So as mentioned previously, this technology is really not new, but what is new is making sure that you have a relaxed and authentic experience. Obviously, 10 years ago, if you were to go in a lab and get, for example, just the EEG, so 32 or 64 wet electrodes on your head, it would not feel as natural as it is today. For example, when you can use, as depicted in this photo, a dry EEG headset that looks like a headband and has 7 channels that can collect EEG signals from your prefrontal neurocortex. So the importance of the third step is that you get to have a very relaxing and normal experience for you as a subject or the respondent. And we simply tell you in the third step, enjoy whatever it is that we're testing. If it's a website, you go through the website and you do your thing. If it's a piece of content, you get to enjoy the video, the show, or whatever it is that we're testing. And if it's a physical product, you actually get to try out the physical product and enjoy. What's happening on the back end is the fourth step, where you as the researcher are monitoring how the respondents are going through the research project, and you get to see how the dashboard is getting populated and how data is flowing in real time. The one thing that is important to mention here is that the consumers are guided via the mobile app on both what to do, how to put on the wearables, and also why are we collecting this data and what is the single purpose of this data collection. The mobile app also leaves timestamps along with the biometric data, so we can know exactly when an emotional reaction was evoked. And we use a technology called the lab streaming layer as a synchronization tool in order to be able to really capture when an emotion was sparked with millisecond precision and connect that to the stimuli. Now, the first reaction we get when we tell this to someone who's new to the field is, wow, this sounds amazing. This sounds as if you can read someone's mind. But how do we know that this is possible? And what is the validation behind it? How do we know it's accurate, it's robust enough? And in our case, the validation looks twofold. On one side, we have validation from actual paying customers, and the other validation is from third-party objective researchers. So the first part are the customers, and we've been happy that we had Fortune 100 companies as clients for years now. We've been present in more than 44 countries, both through our own brand and also through our partners. But our system has been used to analyze some of the biggest and the most important consumer brands worldwide. The profile of our customer is typically someone who's working at the consumer market insights or consumer technical insights departments. In some situations, when the companies are big enough, we also deal with the consumer neuroscience department. And essentially what they do is that they run different research projects on the brand, which can range anywhere from very R&D centered, where we analyze the actual product formula and we get to benchmark how do we improve the formula, but also testing things like product packaging, the ergonomics of it, what is the reaction that it evokes, and then lastly, everything that's very easy to analyze and very fun, which is mostly digital experiences, digital consumer reactions, and also marketing and communication techniques. And these logos are just some of the logos of the companies we've been working with. For all of them, we're an approved vendor for several years now, and we've been very lucky and happy to have them as clients. In terms of academia, we have partners and validation from local to global. One of them is our incredible host here today. So the Faculty of Business and Economics in Zagreb, where we have a mini effective computing lab, which is used both for the curriculum, for our class in effective computing, but also to run research experiments for some of our corporate clients and partners that want to engage with effective computing for the first time. We also have the Institute of Social Science, where they run their own experiments, typically in analyzing emotional reactions for the needs of psychological research. And lastly, we also have global partners in research. Some of them are institutions like the University of Zurich, where they have even a dedicated neuroeconomics department that runs separate experiments focusing on behavioral economics and what is the impact that effective computing to do to supplement the traditional neuroimaging techniques. In terms of the press and the interest that this field is experiencing, it's been a very interesting time because the press has recently discovered that companies are using these types of technologies in order to monitor emotional reactions and get the actual response from consumers instead of relying on questionnaires, focus interviews, or self-report techniques. So we've been very amused by the fact that the press recently, especially in the last year or so, has discovered that companies big to small, tech to more traditional, are really starting to adopt effective computing across the board, whether it's by designing new products or really implementing it as a part of their product offering. For example, what Uber is doing with their mobile app. Now, coming forward to the main products, to tell you a bit more about how it looks like to actually use our product and how are they structured. The first thing we need to say when talking about emotional AI or effective computing is that there are typically two ways of doing it in terms of the number of data points that you collect. One is unimodal and the other is multimodal. Unimodal is relying obviously on a single data source. The most common one is facial coding, so analyzing only the facial reactions of your face. This is monitoring the 47 muscles on your face and capturing small movements that typically last only a couple of milliseconds and are difficult to capture with the human eye, but easier to capture with computer vision. This is the most common one, but also the most problematic one. And the reason why is that capturing facial coding data alone is not enough to understand the full depth and granularity of human emotional reactions. This is why we prefer the second one, which is multimodal, and that essentially means collecting more than a single data source. In our case, ranging from 4 all the way up to 11 different biometric data points in order to supplement and actually have a cross-validation option to get higher accuracy and higher granularity. So because of that, we have 2 products that deal with different levels of biometric data collected. One is Lite and the other one is Pro. Lite is focusing on everything you can do with collecting audio and video data alone, so without needing any wearables. And Pro is everything you can do with wearable devices and a smartphone. The difference between these is that Lite focuses on everything you can do by collecting physical data, and Pro is everything you can collect with physiological data. These have different distinctions, especially when dealing about theoretical effective computing. They have different levels of accuracy and granularity. Pro is typically used for much more robust and detailed analysis, while Lite is used more as a high-level estimate and something of more of an introductory. So when we talk about the product specifically, Lite is designed to do fully remote analysis of consumer behavior at scale. And for Lite, it's really all you need is a personal computer and internet or a smartphone. And the type of data we can collect are primary information such as facial coding, but also speech sentiment analysis. Speech sentiment analysis is analyzing not only what we're saying in terms of the choices of our words, but also analyzing the tone, the pitch, and the cadence of our voice in order to get more granular sentiment information. It also analyzes hand movements. So for example, whether I'm being really jitterish and waving with my hands a lot, or if I'm sitting really straight. It also analyzes posture and body movement. So for example, if I'm sitting up straight, slouching, or really leaning in because I'm very interested, all of these are data points that get analyzed and crunched in Lite. What we can also do, and this is obviously not good enough for diagnostic purposes, but is good enough to get the high-level emotional gauging of reactions, is heart rate and respiration rate. And this is based on the RGB skin color changes that happen on our face and neck area. And in order to do this, we would need a very good light conditioning and also very good high quality camera, which I'm not having at the moment. So the only reason why we're mentioning this is because that is a theoretical option, but it does require a bit of more preparation. For Pro is really everything you can do with wearable devices and collecting physiological data. It's typically much more in depth and it focuses on really getting as much as possible in terms of the granularity of data. The primary data points that we take here are information like EEG, but also information such as electrodermal activity, also known as galvanic skin response, which is essentially how much, when, and where our skin is perspirating or sweating. It's typically collected in between the fingers of your hands. And this is a metric that can be collected through Pro and different wearables. Also information such as HRV, a metric very good and very relevant for stress estimations, are the type of metrics that we collect with Pro. And altogether, Pro includes more than 11 different biometric data points that enable you to really get the full picture and decipher the drivers behind a specific emotional reaction that is evoked. Now getting forward to the timelines and how different customers are using our products. Now, the first thing that we have to say, as mentioned previously, is that light is typically used at the beginning of a research process. And then the purpose of the light is to observe especially new consumer patterns and behaviors that are emerging and to articulate our hypothesis. What happens after that is that we move forward to Pro, and the goal with Pro is to get deeper insights and really validate or null the hypothesis. After that, what comes into play is we get to extract the insights from both Light and Pro, and we get to propose different versions of the product in order to A/B test and emulate what works best in the next version. So that's the typical way that we see our customers using it. We start with light to observe something new, a phenomenon that's happening on the market. That's when we articulate our hypothesis. We then use Pro and ship over devices, whatever and however is needed in order to examine these respondents and these subjects to explore deeper a phenomenon that's happening. After we validate or null the hypothesis, we then use the actionable insights in order to change the product or formula, website, campaign, and then we get to test that and emulate what we see is performing best on the market. Now, in order to make this a bit more realistic and a bit more concrete, we'll be moving forward to a case study with one of our long-term clients that we've been working for years and still work with them on a daily basis. So the purpose of this case study is to show how an actual company, a big multinational brand, has used Tacit technology, obviously as one of the many tools under their belt, in order to transform every touch point that they had with with their customers. The duration of this project was more than 20 months, and it's still ongoing. The client is a big Fortune 100 company, and their main objective was really to achieve consumer experience superiority in every market segment. So to have a superior product formula, to have a superior product packaging and positioning, and then in the end, to have a superior marketing and communications campaign. Now, to provide a bit of context and background for this project. For those of you who have been following, especially personal care and FMCG brands, they've been really entering a very interesting phase. So typically these big, especially incumbent and iconic brands would have a very specific position on the market. Very few companies could compete because no one really had their level of production capabilities, infrastructure in terms of distribution, and no one could afford the brand and marketing budgets that they had in place. So really the probability of having a valid competitor was quite low, and the likelihood of them taking over was quite improbable. What was happening in the past couple of years is that the market is getting flooded by challenger indie brands and by D2C brands. The challenger indie brands typically have a more authentic both production process, they have more authentic marketing campaigns, and the D2C brands were typically raising large amounts of money from venture capital funds and operating in very unrealistic terms. What both of those market conditions have been doing for these big and formerly iconic brands is that all of a sudden there was much more competition than was previously happening. And that's also fueled by the fact that consumer behavior, or ritual and patterns, as they call them internally, are now changing at a much faster and higher pace than previously. So previously you would have quite loyal users that would use a brand for years and years, but with such aggressive marketing that's happening online, especially with micro-targeting on social media, it's been really difficult to retain loyal consumers. So because of that, Tacit had several jobs within this big project. And one of them is to work in optimizing the product formula alone. So really the actual physical personal care product, to research and then inspect different fragrance options, different color changes, really the actual product formula. The second one is unlocking new growth markets. So really researching in detail on what are the new and emerging patterns that we see on the market and how can we use them in order to really position our brand for future growth. The third was quantifying and structuring consumer feedback, which was typically very unstructured and very random and all over the place. We had to take it and then boil it down to something that's accurate and actionable for the production teams. And then lastly, to really use all of that and to improve the business outcomes for the up and coming product launch. Now, in terms of the Tacit approach, our goal here was first to do the benchmarking, so to diagnose and analyze where the brand is now or where we want to have it in the future, and to assess the competitors from a consumer experience perspective. So to really map out what are the emotions evoked by the competitors and by our client's brand, and then to draw a line and say who's performing better at what stage and what are the reasons that are driving these reactions. The second is to articulate growth opportunities and then propose A/B tests for our hypothesis that we can use in order to tackle that growth. And then third is really to emulate all of those best practices and to propose them in a consumer experience that can help them to achieve superiority. Now, this may sound quite simple and straightforward, but what's actually happening on the back end of this is that different brand touch points required different project designs. And the way that our platform works is essentially our main product is a self-serving platform for researchers. So what our client got to do is to design different research projects for different cohorts and test every touch point, some in a parallel and some in a consecutive way. So this is an example of how each business unit get to leverage our platform. And for example, in this case, this is how it would look like to test an actual website or a product, for example, in the UK. The first thing that you see is that the sample size was 100 UK-based respondents. And the first thing that comes to mind for anyone who's in research is that that's quite low. And the reason why 100 respondents is not as low as it sounds is because when using multimodal effective computing, it's much more granular and accurate than explicit traditional research, which is why the sample sizes are quite low and the turnaround is much faster. So the main element here was that you can actually get the same result with a smaller sample size that you would get on a much larger with traditional methodologies, because the new methodologies are much more sensitive and you're able to discriminate between different results much faster and in a much more efficient way. The second thing that you can see here is that we do baselining questionnaires. This is the baseline that was mentioned in the methodology section, and this is where we get to know what your true self is like. We do this by asking questions like, what day is it today? But also by asking psychological assessment questions in order to profile you as a user and, for example, see if you're creative or a bit more disciplined, if you're an introvert or an extrovert. And what happens after that is we can use those questions in order to slice and dice the data in the dashboard later on. After that, the question that comes up is the actual stimuli or the matter that we're researching. In this case, it was a website. We were benchmarking two websites, one from our client and the other one from their main competitor. And the way that we would structure these websites is that they would appear in a randomized and balanced order. So not to achieve any priming effects, and in order to be careful that not everyone is, for example, loving the first website and exhausted by the time they get to the second website, they would appear in a randomized and balanced order so that we can have reliable results. After that, we have the follow-up questions. For example, did you like the website? Did you get to do what you intended to do? And after that, the test is complete. The data is automatically uploaded to our servers, and researchers in real time can see their results. The key thing here is the output, the granularity, and the fact that the data is multidimensional. Now, what's interesting in the output is that people typically think that the main output are emotions like joy, sadness, disgust, and anger, which are basic emotions. But in the world of affective computing and researchers, that's just where we start. So giving you how basic emotions are popping up throughout the consumer experience is actually not as insightful and actionable as one would imagine, because it doesn't tell the brand manager what, or the product person, what to do next. What does tell them is different granular KPIs that we typically get to work with on a case-by-case basis. So one of the metrics that we really see a lot is, for example, attention and focus. And the classical example here is that we get to calculate and analyze, for example, the number of times when you blink, how fast do you blink, and how long do you blink. And we use that data in order to calculate attention levels, but also drowsiness and fatigue levels, which is very relevant if you're, for example, trying to observe a very menial and stressful or annoying task. Also, things like noticing when someone is within their baseline, or for example, in an optimal or tilt state, is very relevant. But what ends up happening is that we really get to deal mostly with our proprietary metrics. And these are things like, for example, arousal, meaning how strong or weak an emotion is, valence, meaning how positive or negative an emotion is, or cognitive workload. So what is the level of mental effort that you need to invest in order to comprehend what's being shown to you? Also stress level, the level of discomfort that you feel when presented with a stimuli. And then most, especially of our long-term clients, then request a sort of customized composite metric where we get to assign different values and different weights and averages to this output data, and then create a KPI of their own, which best reflects both their brief and business objective. Also, alongside with the analyzed data, we offer all of our clients raw data and timestamps, which are dedicated with each unit measure for example, whether it's facial coding or speech sentiment, because a lot of them still want to run independent analyses on their own. So we offer that in the platform as well. And now when discussing how does it look like from testing a product to shipping it and then relaunching it, the first thing that we did is we tested the product formula. This sounds very simple, but because things, especially in the personal space, things like taste, aroma, and fragrances are subjective and very difficult to articulate. This is why the so-called parity problem is popping up in explicit and traditional research. And this is why companies are using affective computing as the best methodology to discriminate between these results and best determine which prototype has statistical significance in superiority. The second step is analyzing packaging and positioning. So analyzing the ergonomics of the packaging, making sure it's easy, understandable, and intuitive to use. And then lastly, it's optimizing the marketing and communication. And the way all of that is done is really over years of good collaboration and research from the R&D team, insights, and consumer science team across different brands and markets and segments. So some elements are really fast, and turnaround, for example, for online content is quite fast. But some, when you get to deal with different subcontractors and vendors, they last for much longer because a lot of these companies are outsourcing a lot of their functions. So some of them can last anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks to both design, collect data, and report on a project, but some take more than 6 to 3 months, and some are just an ongoing project that we get to deal with. And then how fast does it work from our clients saying we need to test this to us rolling out first Lite and Pro? It can literally take up to a couple of days if our client has everything in place, meaning they have all the materials that they want to test, they know who their ideal customer profile is, they know how many people they want to recruit and where, and they also know and have, for example, the product prototypes that they want to test. They know whether it's a central location or home use test. So the timeline for each of these tests really very much depends on the client and how ready are they. But on our side, it's all done through our self-serving platform. So it's quite simple and easy for us to make sure that any and every experiment can go live. And side-by-side analysis at the end of it is that discriminating between old and new product formula needs to be quite evident. And in this case, it really is. This is a screenshot, unfortunately, without the X and Y axis, where you can see that V1 represents the new and improved product after the launch, and V0 on the red dotted line is the old product. So what was needed here is really to achieve superiority on almost every touch point. There's some elements which we're still working on, which you can see in the second step, but it's still work in progress. And especially in today's very dynamic market, the work and the research is never done. So we're transitioning to the so-called always on research. But the general objective really was addressed, and that's to deliver a superior consumer experience across almost every touch point. And now I'm very sorry for the slides here being a bit blurry, but essentially the main element here are the business results that we've achieved for our client. Unfortunately, you can't read them here, but I'll explain to them. One is less time and money spent on research. This is what we're most proud of. And the reason why is, as explained previously, traditional and explicit research would require more sample sizes, more prototypes to test, and more time and money to do both of those. Because our methodology is more sensitive, it's easier to discriminate between results. We almost never have parity results, and we easily detect statistical significance in between the two, whether it's stimuli, product, or samples that we're testing. This is why we're most proud of that milestone achieved. The second milestone, which is growth in sales and less support calls, are really a collaboration across different business units and different partners that we got to work with. So it's by any means, we're just a small piece of a big puzzle. But we're still quite proud that our client was able to find out, articulate, and address new growth opportunities on the market while working with different business units to achieve that. And because there was a change in business model, there was an increased number of customer support calls that we were able to address by rewording and re-articulating the value proposition. The output of everything that we're doing here is that there are different product formulas that we get to see. So for example, we get to know that, let's say Gen Z, they like what's known as high arousal and low valence content. So content that is quite intense, very explosive in their usage, but much less enjoyable. And they actually use, for example, stress as a mechanism to help in sales conversions. What they don't like is high cognitive workloads. So having to think for too long and too hard is not something that this generation loves. But for example, now an older generation, millennials, act slightly different. They like high valence, lower arousal content. So content that's primarily enjoyable or pleasurable, as we would say it, low stress, so almost relaxing, and a medium to low cognitive workload, or actually low cognitive workload is not required, but medium can actually be tolerable. One of the things that we're very happy about is that we're not the only company in effective computing. We're very happy that more companies are engaging, and the fact that our competition is also doing both multimodal and also physical and physiological data collection, because we think that's really the best way for this market and this industry to become more robust and more mature. But what comes after this is addressing the main challenges, and the main challenges arise from privacy, accuracy, and ethical approvals on a use case by use case basis. So the first thing is we're having a lot of emotional AI experiments that are being unsupervised. For example, what Amazon is doing with the US airports. But there's really a lack of consistency between US and EU regulation. Not to go into detail, but the root cause of all of this is the different way in which we perceive personal data protection. And the reason why this is so relevant is because the second element, and that is the accuracy. So as mentioned previously, one of the main problems in unimodal effective computing is actually the lack of accuracy. So in order to address that, what needs to happen is we should insist on populating the public databases with more diverse data sets and sample sizes in order to train algorithms that can then become industry standards. Because what's happening with facial coding today is that most of it is trained on white male adults. And if you're anything except that, you're really not going to have a very accurate estimation from the algorithm. Lastly, we think not all use cases are created equal, and not all are ethical and appropriate. In an ideal scenario, all research projects and use cases would be audited on a case-by-case basis, both from an internal ethics committee consisted primarily of stakeholders and shareholders, but also an external and objective one that has no vetted interest in the project, but simply says whether they see any unintended negative consequences here. That's something that we see as a golden standard. And when concluding all of this, and when talking about where is this space going, we really see a couple of phases with each and every new technology. One is identifying a new and promising tech. Secondly is discovering and validating the first use cases and seeing how they can bring business value. But then the third is really mapping out all of the technical and ethical challenges that we discover, and then start to map out what are the unintended consequences before actually achieving full deployment. And we think that when talking about effective computing or emotional AI, we're still in the very early days. So despite being very excited and optimistic about the technology, we still don't know as much on what are some of the things that we should be working on in terms of privacy, accuracy, and the ethics approvals. And even to kind of close this off with a classical Gartner chart, even by Gartner standards, this is from October last year, we're still 5 to 10 years away from emotional AI or effective computing achieving some kind of a mainstream usage. So with that being said, I would like to thank you all for your attention. I would like to welcome any questions, and again, hopefully we'll be able to meet in person sometime soon.